So I'm happy to introduce Reverend Phyllis Currat, who has been engaged with the Parliament since 1993. She founded the Women's Task Force, created a historic inaugural Women's Assembly, drafted the Declaration for the Dignity and Human Rights of Women, and guided it to unanimous adoption by the 2015 Parliament. She now serves as program chair. She is also a pioneer in the revival of Euro-Indigenous wisdom traditions and a Wiccan priestess. Time declared her as one of America's leading thinkers, and New York Magazine called her work the culture's next big idea. She is also an author and an attorney whose groundbreaking cases secured the rights of Wiccans and other religious minorities.
Thank you, Anna. When I hear that, I always think my mother would be proud, surprised, but proud. So it's a huge honor and a privilege for me to be here today with all of you, and especially with our three women speakers who are remarkable, courageous, and examples of precisely who and what women need to be at this critical moment. I'm thrilled that we are going to continue a conversation that we began at the Parliament in 2023, where both Reverend Butler and Dr. Abadi were plenary speakers for the women's plenary, and where Tracy was supposed to join us was unable to, but the panel went on, and one of the most important questions about reproductive rights and the struggles that women are facing, and an issue which now has even greater importance as we see the consequences of this post-Roe Dobbs era. So we are participating in an ongoing conversation. The framework is twofold. One, the Global Ethic, which was a founding document of the Parliament created by Hans Kung and some very enthusiastic others. Everybody wanted to get into the room in 1993 to participate in that. And it's a document that guides our actions and articulates in a few paragraphs, insufficient for my taste, the importance of the equality between men and women, and the urgency of all of us, but especially those of us who are people of faith, to attend to and take all actions necessary to stop violence against women. Women are on the forefront of what is happening right now, which is the ascendance of authoritarianism around the globe. We are the canary in the coal mine. Whatever is happening happens first to us, invariably. And the overturning of Roe is an example of it in the United States. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we will have today, because we have women who are very well aware of the factors that have given rise to that decision and the consequences, and what it means for women and for democracy. So it's one facet. Women have always been activists and powerful forces in fighting against autocracy, from contemporary civil rights and protest movements to ancient spiritual movements. And we are, again, on the forefront, and we have to be. I asked right before we start how you're feeling, and there is a feeling of both worry and good reason for it, and I think tremendous hope. I personally think that it's women who are going to save democracy, at least in the United States. There was a great line last night, that the Dobbs decision contained a line about women having electoral and political power, and they're about to see it exercised. And so that gives me hope. And the three women who are with us today also give me tremendous hope, and I hope they will do that for you as well. So the quick format, I am going to introduce each of them one at a time. They'll speak for 10 minutes. And then we are going to have a roundtable conversation, which I know you'll agree with me is going to be much too short. It's going to be approximately 30 minutes. We'll take some questions from you all. You can put them in the chat. It'll be followed by, I think, breakout sessions. Some of our speakers may have to leave us if those run a little bit long, but it'll give you an opportunity to really reflect on and engage what you've learned. And you'll see as we go along that Last year, I think a lot of our conversation was around waking people up and articulating the nature of the problem. And this year it is about action, all the more so. What is it that we can do to engage individually, collectively, in communities of women and in communities of faith? And so I'll begin by introducing Dr. Suzanne Abadian. She's the Executive Director of the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington, D.C. She brings a long history of working in interfaith contexts in the academic, private, and government sectors. Moreover, as an Iranian American and a member of a religious minority, working on behalf of religious freedom and justice are similarly important components of her work. Dr. Abadian has served as a Franklin Fellow at the U.S. State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and has also served as a fellow at MIT's Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values. She's a graduate of Harvard University and a former Fulbright Scholar in the Specialist Program in Canada, supporting the well-being of First Nations and similar settler communities. Excuse me. So welcome, Suzanne. The microphone is yours.
Well, I want to thank you, Phyllis, for the introduction and for the opportunity to join this, as you said, exceptional panel of women in conversation. I'm humbled to be here, not just because of who's here with me on the panel, but also given who's not here, who else is on the front lines. For example, my Iranian compatriots who are bravely standing up to a brutally repressive system back in Iran, and Afghanis, and many, many other women and men around the world who are facing rape, torture, death to claim their freedom. I want to begin by reminding us that here in the US, we're all at the front lines defending democracy. You don't have to be on stage or be making a lot of noise or fanfare, but in fact, daily attitudes and actions are tantamount to being on the front lines defending democracy. Our greatest battle at this time is with fear, despair, overwhelm, cynicism, and apathy. Many people here in the US are exhausted by and dreading the 2024 presidential campaign, a critical election given that one of the candidates is clearly authoritarian and bent on destroying our democracy. David Brooks, in a New York Times March 7th article, described how many Americans are dreading the ugliness of it all, the constant sense of national crises. He wrote, "It's almost as if people have been beaten down by the last decade. They've lost the self-confidence to wish for more." Being at the front lines defending democracy means we choose to wish for more. We choose to adopt optimism. We choose to see the possibilities, to believe in our grit and our capacity to turn them into probabilities and be the generation that turns back the autocratic tide, even when things look as bleak as they might to some now. Every time you do not capitulate to victim mentality, but remember yourself to be the powerful being you are, and especially in the US, know that we can choose again, at least choose our attitude. Every time you don't get seduced by conspiracy theories that are fueled by fear, every time you turn away from habitually blaming of others, but rather choose to see what you can do to make a difference, choose to take responsibility, and choose to be generous with assisting others in need, choose to take constructive action, choose to stay curious about and open to people who are different than you are. Choose to nurture what's good and noble about humankind and not just focus on what's wrong. All of these constitute being at the front lines of defending democracy. Prioritizing the health of our children, every single one of them is being at the front lines of defending democracy. Sometimes it's a moment-to-moment battle, nothing dramatic, but on the front lines nonetheless. Making the commitment to vote during this critical election, and let's not kid ourselves, vote for Biden is an act of defending democracy. Every one of us is at the forefront defending democracy. Hand in hand, we step forward. One of my favorite quotes about America comes from the Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington, and he wrote, "Critics say that America is a lie because its reality falls so far short of its ideals. They are wrong. America is not a lie. It is a disappointment. But it can be a disappointment only because it is also a hope. I think he's right. The fact is the US still represents for many a great hope. Whether we want to be exceptional or not, we still represent something grand to the world. And we can do this. We are enough. We have enough. Our economy is strong. Our people are creative and fueled by immigrants who bring fresh ideas and determination. We can do this. So this is a Parliament of World Religions discussion. So now let me turn to the role that religion plays in defending democracy. Whether we are confronting militant Christian nationalism here at home or violent and extreme Islam abroad or any other weaponized religious ideology, one clear threat to democracy is religious arrogance, reflected in notions like triumphalism. Let me explain what I mean. I borrow the term triumphalism from one of my teachers, the late Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who founded the Jewish Renewal Movement. Reb Zalman talked about how the three Abrahamic religions have in common an ideological overtone of triumphalism, the belief that at the end of time, when Judgment Day comes, we, Jews, Christians, or Muslims, will be the ones that the Holy Ones will draw close. We are the ones God will choose to sit by his side. And the rest, well, the rest finally will be disavowed. Triumphalism, in essence, claims that we are the best and truest religion, and only through devotion to our sacred way will you merit redemption. All other ways are incomplete and lesser than. Now, in my anthropological studies of indigenous peoples, I found that the translation of the name that many tribes worldwide have for themselves is the people, with the implication that others, not of the tribe, are not the people. So this kind of tribalism might be a natural and universal phenomenon, an us and them distinction that creates a sense of belonging. But when does defining a communal boundary to create a sense of belonging and taking pride in one's own group's distinct attributes turn into something more insidious, something that turns the people, our people, as being somehow better than those who are not us? And what happens when this better than belief gets linked to the notion of having a special relationship with the divine and then becomes institutionalized as part of a religious dogma? The triumphalist features of Abrahamic religions have led to a competing grandiosity, with each faith community believing that they are God's uniquely chosen and favored people, the younger religions believing they have superseded the older ones. As far as I know, indigenous religious and spiritual expressions do not hold such a belief in their superiority of their understanding of the sacred or their relationship with the divine. In fact, the sacred is generally considered a great mystery, ultimately unknowable from where we stand as humans. My own faith tradition, Zoroastrianism, also lacks a supremacist orientation. Once triumphalism takes roots in a religious community, especially when it's enshrined in doctrine, it does not die easily. And when people experience collective trauma and are caught in fear and in a survival orientation, they can easily gravitate to these toxic doctrinal strands. Long-standing collective traumas have made even the non-monotheistic religions who do not have intrinsic triumphalist tenets vulnerable to the mix of religious supremacism and ultranationalism. The rise of Hindu chauvinism in India and Buddhist chauvinism in Sri Lanka or Myanmar demonstrates that these paths too are susceptible to the dangers of religious arrogance, not just the Abrahamic faith. So we have to educate our congregants that alongside all the inspiring and beautiful teachings, alongside expressions of love and compassion, there are shadow elements and toxic doctrinal strands. The damage and the trauma that our faith communities have caused in the name of the divine needs to be looked at and the appropriate lessons learned. Acknowledging this is bound to make us uncomfortable. But if we are to transform these malevolent tendencies that are part of the human condition and that afflict all human enterprises, including religion, we have to be honest. For example, how many Christians really know what was done to indigenous peoples in Indian boarding schools, all in the name of Jesus? And for their part, how many Muslims know about the brutal conquest and colonization of places like Iran by ISIS-like Muslim Arabs beginning 1400 years ago? In the case of Iran, the seeds of Islamic supremacy were planted during that period of conquest and generated ripple effects which are manifest today in the arrogant stance of today's Iranian theocracy. Christian nationalism in the US and the Khomeini cronies in Iran actually have a great deal in common, something we can term predatory evangelism, the grandiose belief that they are entitled to force their beliefs on others because they have a special connection to the divine. Spiritual and moral integrity demands that we admit, first to ourselves and to others, the harm being done in the name of the divine by co-religionists. We must demonstrate genuine remorse over the destructive religious arrogance. And beyond humble acknowledgements and apologies, we need to commit ourselves to detoxify the religious teachings that have perpetuated supremacist thinking and behavior. Thank you.
Phyllis, you're muted.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'm going to ask Tracy, Reverend Tracy Blackman, to speak next. I'm following the alphabetical order as the last name rather than the first. So, Tracy, if you will.
Absolutely. And thank you for this invitation to be.
Give me one moment. I apologize. Let me pull out your bio, and so people have a full appreciation of who they're about to hear from. Reverend Tracy Blackman is the CEO and founder of Hope Builds, LLC, a newly launched consultancy for churches and organizations eager to build the just and equitable communities they imagine. She served as Associate General Minister and Vice President in the national setting of the United Church of Christ for 7 years, successfully launching several of the anchor initiatives for the denomination's local church and justice ministries. Pastor T, as she is affectionately called, has spent the last 3 decades preaching, teaching, and living a theology that consistently challenges communities to hear and respond to the crises of the suffering in the world through embodied discipleship.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I am excited to be here with these fabulous women who are on this panel with me. Happy International Women's Day to everyone who is joining us today. And Dr. Abadan has really gotten us off to a profound framework that is pretty expansive and that I just want to say amen to. I want to also acknowledge that in my way of talking about some of what Dr. Abadan was sharing with us is this need for those of us of faith to engage in a practice of deconstructing chosenness, which gets at what she was referencing when she said this triumphalism, this idea that somehow God chooses a part of God's creation over other parts of God's creation and puts them at a higher level than others. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later in the few moments that I have. What it begin with, though, is acknowledging that not only America, but the world could look glaringly different on January 1, 2025. Glaringly different, depending on the outcome of not just our election, but some global elections. And the conflicts that we are facing, the pivotal elections and the geopolitical forces that are creating critical moments in this year. And unfortunately, in the US at least, it's my opinion that we have very short memory, very short memories. Prior to our current president, we were in a state of flux. And I am not one that lays all of that at the feet of the president, the former president. Certainly, he is not the only far-right populist that we have surging in our political system right now. But we seem to have forgotten that we were in the middle of a pandemic that the leadership of this nation refused to acknowledge, that we lost many, many people who did not have to die because we failed to act as a nation. We seem to have forgotten that. We seem to have forgotten that the promises that this country made to Black people or African descendant people here around voting were once again a disappointment to a constituency that has continued to be faithful to this democracy or the hope of this democracy. We're still working on that. We seem to have forgotten that women lost the right to bodily autonomy. And that's really critical because we will be the first to leave our children, particularly our children who present as women, future women, with less rights than we inherited when we began. And I lose sleep over that at night. I don't know about the rest of you, but I, as a pastor, still take calls from people who are trying to figure out what to do in critical moments. In my home state of Alabama, they've now outlawed IVF, clearly without even an understanding of what it means, right? And so we are on this spiral turn that for me, as a person of faith, really concerns me on several levels. And I'll just try to tap on them because we'll have lots of time for discussion. I'm most concerned about the inability of our nation, the growing inability of our nation to have compassion for the other in ways that I haven't seen in my lifetime. You might say, well, that's not going to be fixed with an election, but an election is the beginning. We've lost the ability to have reasonable dialogue with one another. And we've lost the presence of a reasonably unbiased media to help us in that regard. If we are going to have changes in attitudes and opinions now, it's going to have to be done one by one in the conversations that we're having with people. And I am increasingly disheartened that we make assumptions about the other. We've had good runs with Republicans and we've had good runs with Democrats. And now we're at a place where we seem to not be able to see the good in anyone other than ourselves. And this, my friends, for me is a deep threat to the possibility of democracy here and democracy elsewhere. We've lost our ability to negotiate across political lines. No one wants to give. Everyone just wants what they want. And as a person of faith, I have to sound the alarm about this. No matter who's in the office, we have to find a way to bridge this widening chasm between all of us who are Americans. I share Dr. Abidan's conviction that one outcome is certainly worse than the other. But whoever is in office, we have lots of work to do politically. And we have it to do as women in particularly, because the Dobbs decision, yes, struck down Roe v. Wade, but it did something else that is more of a threat even than that for me. And it suggested that we should be a country that is ruled by state law instead of by our federal legislators. And what that will mean is that from state to state, you can have different things going on. For me, that is reminiscent of a time when people like me were enslaved. And a lot of that came down to state law. There are some things that should supersede the power of the state. And I'm worried about that if this election doesn't go in a way that that distances us from the autocratic type of government that I see taking place. And so I think I want to stop there because there is so much to unpack and to talk about. And I want us not to be convinced that we don't have the ability to navigate this moment and steer this moment in ways that lead us in a different direction. And I'm biased, but I happen to believe that if that's going to be done, it's going to be done by women. In South Africa, they have a chant that I hold really dear to my heart. Once you've touched the women, you've struck a rock. And once you hit the rock, you will be demolished. And so that's how I'm feeling about this moment when you mentioned what President Biden said last night about you're about to see the power of women. I hope so. And I hope that you're not going to see the power of just women on one political party, but you're going to see the power of women across the gamut, fighting for not just ourselves, but for the generations of children that are still yet to come. The generations of children that are still yet to come. I have close friends that are of multiple faiths, and one of my dearest friends, who is a rabbi here in St. Louis, is having to relocate her entire family because they have a trans child. And Missouri is no longer a safe place for that child. I have friends who have been forced to carry non-viable pregnancies because Missouri is now a place where you cannot get an abortion. And the right to be able to travel to other places is a privilege that is not afforded to everyone. So what's at stake for me and what I believe is at stake for this nation is life as we know it, is freedom as we know it, is voice as we know it. What's at stake for this country, even if you listen to the recent Supreme Court decision, beyond the unanimous vote that President Trump should be allowed to be on every ballot or should be on Colorado's ballot, that was the case. If you read the commentary underneath that, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not using the right words for it, but it's not a dissent because there wasn't a dissent, but the more progressive judges made a statement, and they were joined in that statement by the conservative woman on the court who sounded an alarm that they were concerned about the overreach of this Supreme Court, that they chose not to just make a decision on what was before them, but to speak into what was needed to continue down this trajectory of conservatism that is based on their religious beliefs. Finally, I want to stop there. I want to say this last thing and stop. I am deeply concerned about the merging of any church and state in the United States. We have lost our ability to exercise what we say is due to us, a separation of church and state. I'm currently involved in a case in Missouri where the legislators boldly proclaim that they've stricken down abortion here because of their faith. America is not a place where we should legislate faith. Everyone should be free to exercise their faith as they see fit. And depending on how this election goes, we will either preserve that right or we will see it go away. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. It's a brilliant lead-in also to our next speaker, Reverend Butler. But just to briefly comment on what you're saying, we are seeing precisely what you said with the decision that just came down in Alabama, where the judge cited God and his interpretation of Christianity as the rationale for the decision, which wiped out the right to in vitro fertilization because of an idea held by some members of a particular faith that personhood begins at conception. But this has been a strategy for a long time to reach that point of power for enforcement of a particular theological perspective, and rights fall in the face of it. So thank you, and a perfect lead into our next speaker, Reverend Jennifer Butler. She's the executive director of Faith in Democracy, a newly launched effort to amplify the voices of religious leaders in support of democracy and human rights in the face of resurgent religious nationalism globally and she's also the founder and former executive director of Faith in Public Life. Reverend Butler spent 10 years advancing religious arguments for human rights through the United Nations arena. Her book, which I highly recommend, Born Again, The Christian Right Globalized, was the first to document transnational anti-gender activism and its potential impact on democracy and human rights. It's my great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. And it is just wonderful to be with my two colleagues and partners in struggle, Susan and Tracy. And I want to just begin by saying I am truly hopeful as I sit with this nexus of women and hearing this analysis that my two sisters have brought that helps us, I think, ground in our reality and have a framework through which to understand what is happening right now in the world today. Without understanding, without analysis, we become paralyzed. And that's exactly what tyranny wants us to do. That's what an autocrat wants to have happen to us, and we can't allow that to happen. So thank you for this gathering and for pulling it together. I want to begin by just naming that at the top of every autocrat's to-do list is to control religion and to control women. An autocrat has to control religion because faith is what gives us moral courage to resist. Faith is what gives us hope that human beings can live together without hierarchy or oppression. Autocrats have to control women because a hierarchical family with a tight social control over procreation and the education of children is critical to maintaining a political system based on dominance. This is always closely tied to racism and xenophobia because autocrats, who are always ethno-nationalists, have to ensure racial, ethnic, and caste purity. So they have to get women to buy into systems that oppress them. They grant some women a bit of power over other women, and they threaten those women when they don't comply. They pit us against each other according to our religion, our immigration status, or race, and sometimes we women buy into it. So that is another thing that we must resist. But to control women's bodies is to control the world. Conversely, when we resist and build coalitions across race, religion, class, autocrats are defeated. Democracies honor the dignity of all so that all can thrive. The Jewish story of Moses, which is foundational to the Abrahamic faiths, is a story of women resisting. The Exodus chapter opens with 3 women paving the way for a liberationist movement. The Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah defied the king and refused to commit genocide. Miriam and her mother, no doubt alerted by the Hebrew midwives, float their son to freedom on the Nile, where the king's daughter rescues and raises a Hebrew child slated for death by her father. God sees their organizing, hears their groans, and acts in human history. Women at the beginning of God's move into human history spark future movements to end oppression, including the Black struggle for freedom here in the US. This is a story many of us may know and may have been taught, although I will say growing up, I never even heard about the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and many of us were not taught the story in that way. It's this story that inspires me to found a new organization, Faith and Democracy, which will be a global network of religious leaders working to restore democracy and human rights in the face of resurgent religious nationalism. As my co-speakers have said, democracy is in crisis around the world. According to Freedom House, more than 3/4 of the world's population lives in a country with some restrictions on freedom, the highest proportion in more than a quarter century. And the same Christian nationalists who undermined US democracy are exporting their ideology and their wedge issue tactics around the globe. Wealthy Americans and Russian oligarchs finance this movement to the tune of $280 million across 5 continents over a period of years. I have to say, you need a lot of money if you're going to try to convince people to do something that goes against their faith and their self-interest. I warned the world of this coalition in my book in 2006. It includes groups like the World Congress of Families, Citizen Go, an alliance for defending freedom. And today, that coalition that I documented in its infancy is now full blown. They are passing laws. They are winning elections. They are gutting constitutions and advancing anti-feminist narratives and culture around the globe on every single continent and almost every single country. They stoke fears about gender in order to polarize, to distract, to ultimately gut democracy. Their disinformation campaigns about gender are ways to hide what is actually a white supremacist, xenophobic, autocratic agenda. They claim to champion the family, but their policies harm families. They claim to be religious, but their beliefs are heretical. Let me give a few examples of how they operate and what it looks like. In 2013, Vladimir Putin turned on the spigot of hate against gender equality and LGBTQ people in Russia and across Eastern Europe. He saw this soften the ground for him to pass a so-called policy framework to preserve traditional Russian moral and spiritual values in 2022. This then enabled him to criminalize what they called the propaganda of the non-traditional family. Today, those fighting for women's rights or LGBTQI individuals' rights are considered a national security threat, terrorist. That criminalization was soon expanded to all humanitarian and civil society groups. The construct of women's rights as a threat even extends to Russia's colonial enterprise. In February 2022, Putin justified his war in Ukraine as an effort to fight the West's attempt to destroy traditional values. In Hungary, Viktor Orban took a page from Putin's playbook using anti-LGBTQ policies, not only as a wedge to consolidate a conservative base, but also to compromise the judiciary and control the media and gut the Constitution. This is accelerating in the United States as an autocrat running for president borrows and is inspired by strategies used in Europe. They're sharing ideas and strategies across the Atlantic. Should Trump be elected this fall, Republicans plan to implement an 800-page playbook called Project 2025, which will implement measures similar to what Orban and Putin have done. American conservatives are now rallying behind Putin and Orban as heroes. We see it playing out in the falling support for Ukraine among House Republicans. We see it when Orban gets standing ovations at the annual CPAC, or Conservative Political Action Convention here in the US. And we see it in how former Fox News host Tucker Carlson pandered to Putin when he recently became the first Western journalist in years to interview the autocrat. In Brazil, populist homophobia and transphobia accompanied similar anti-democratic turns. Even before running for president, Jair Bolsonaro warned against the incursion of gender ideologies into schools. Sounds like Florida, doesn't it? And he dismantled the professionalized bureaucracy in favor of super ministries overseen by his allies. He appointed conservative cabinet members who stripped LGBTQI protections from the Ministry of Family, Women, and Human Rights, and then he began to restrict the activities of human rights and environmental NGOs. Bolsonaro, Trump, Putin, Orban all share affinities and mutual political consultants. Steve Bannon, the white supremacist who advised the Trump campaign, advised Bolsonaro to carry out a coup attempt that had all the same features as the U.S. January 6th Capitol insurrection, including Christian nationalists at the front lines. Just a week ago in Ghana, the parliament passed a violent anti-LGBTQ law that now imposes a prison sentence of up to 5 years for the willful promotion, sponsorship, or support of LGBTQI plus activities. Gay sex was already criminalized with a 3-year sentence, but now NGO leaders can be put in jail simply for speaking out. Next, they too will clamp down on all of civil society. This is just a smattering of examples of the transnational effort to use anti-feminist narratives to consolidate power, as well as to undermine established democratic and human rights norms. It has spread to every continent. The same nexus of bad actors is also making inroads at the United Nations, in the European Commission, in the Organization of American States in Latin America. And this year and next, there are super elections, as Reverend Tracy mentioned, and many democracies face dire threats from these far-right parties that are gaining steam. It's a lot. So breathe deep. To counter this threat to human dignity and planetary flourishing, we must reclaim our faith for justice worldwide and build coalitions far and wide so that we cannot be divided. So hear the good news, as I would say in a sermon. In Mexico, millions of viewers have been drawn to a digital campaign created by Catholics for Choice. The campaign uses feminist theology and humor to build a faith-based case for women's rights. In Ghana, the Catholic and Anglican bishops and even a cardinal have spoken out against the anti-LGBTQ law. In Poland, where the anti-democratic Law and Justice Party passed an abortion ban in 2020, millions of women shut down the streets. Although the police tried to quell that peaceful protest with violence and harassment, in 2023, those mass protests translated into massive voter turnout that managed to unseat the Law and Justice Party despite voter suppression efforts by the government. Religious leaders are risking arrest for freedom. Just days ago, the head of the Evangelical Church of Hungary was arrested because he has refused to remain silent again about Viktor Orban's abuses. People will need moral courage to face what is to come. They will need to understand the beauty of what their faith actually calls them to be, so that we can all be inoculated against the propaganda and the fear tactics that come at us. This fascist attempt to smash truth and turn lies into the new reality. Like Shipra, Pua, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter, we must forge international coalitions across race and religious alliance to resist tyranny. And we need to challenge our democracies to finally fulfill their vision of flourishing for all. May we make it so.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we have about a half an hour, and I encourage people to put their questions into the chat, which I will pull up here so we can take a look at it. And I have a number of questions that you've already sort of tackled, which is your appraisal of the current crisis. And we've had three very important angles which all overlap and expand our understanding of it and what's at stake. I think we have a growing sense of that. From a personal perspective and observing, I think part of the struggle that everybody has is a kind of denial and disbelief. You know, how can this be true? How can this be so? It's not really happening until it unfolds around you, right? Until it affects your neighbor, until Roe is overturned and Alabama makes ruling and Missouri passes laws, and the speed with which the change starts to accelerate, right, can catch us off guard if we're not already aware, awake, and engaged. So suddenly we're looking at laws that prohibit women from leaving the state, and that can lead to prosecution and punishment if you're assisting a woman who is leaving the state in order to secure fundamental reproductive health care, because her life is at risk and she can't get care at home. So the pace of this shift requires a kind of a comparable response from us, right? That we need to wake up and to begin to move. And so I think one of the questions that I have for you is what you can use, what you use, and what you can recommend women use in terms of their engagement with their own faith traditions to awaken and to act. Because fear, disbelief, panic, disempowerment is the point, right? To frustrate one's sense of autonomy, one's real autonomy, and one's sense of capacity. And I think that's where our faiths also can provide the essential ingredient that enables us to plant our flags precisely where we are and to take action. So I'm interested if each of you would speak to your faith as a source of inspiration, guidance, a guidance system for action, and then very pragmatically and sort of specifically where you're seeing engagement and action within your faith traditions or across those traditions, where those of us who've joined us today can go to participate in activism. I've always felt that action is the antidote to fear. Action is the antidote to passivity. And it's the antidote to depression. But if you don't know where to go, right, then you don't know how to do. So if that's not too complicated, how your faith is a source of courage and inspiration and models of engagement. And in fact, if there are programs, organizations, you're all involved in those where people can go, where women can go, and those who support them can go to engage in the battle. So I throw it open. I mean, I can call on you, or I think an open conversation. We'll just leave our mics on and
I'll start.
Thank you, Tracy.
It's funny that you asked this question, Phyllis, particularly about places to go. I am in dialogue with several groups who are working on this, all of whom are sworn to secrecy. It's the oddest thing, you know. I think the tenor of the time is such that people don't want to be targeted. So I've been wrestling with that because it's really funny to me that all of these groups are working on the same thing, but everyone's doing it in secret. Don't tell anybody what we're doing. So I'll leave that there. I am leaning very strongly into the fact that my faith is built on what I am for and not what I'm against. Mm-hmm. It's very obvious, but I think we forget sometimes. My faith is built on what I am for and not what I am against. And there are people who share my faith beliefs and people who have other faith beliefs that I feel called to work with, and together we share areas that we will never agree on. We simply will never agree. I do work with the Archbishop here in St. Louis, Missouri. He's Catholic. I am the lead plaintiff on the abortion case, right? We're never going to have a unified front on abortion. But you know what? We're not working on that. We're working on the death penalty. Mm-hmm. We share beliefs on that. I give that as an example. I could give lots of examples like that. I have relationship with Jewish colleagues. We don't agree on what is happening right now. But there are things we do agree about. We do agree about the sanctity of life. We do agree about how everyone should have the right to feel safe where they are. And that's a little bit more challenging for us right now, but we are finding places where we can maintain a connection so that we cannot lose sight of one another's humanity. Mm-hmm. I believe, biasly so, that women have a special superpower that causes us to be nurturing, whatever fashion I don't mean nurturing like becoming a mother. That's not what I mean. We tend to care for the wider community beyond just our insular being. And for me, that is something that I want to tap into. I want women to ask ourselves the question, what are we for? I think you'd be hard pressed to find children whatever stance they're taking, I mean, find women, whatever stance they're taking, who won't say that they are doing it because they care about the future of children. We may not agree about that future, but everyone is doing it because they care about the future of children. Might those be entry points to talking about how we see things differently? Might those be connection points to talking about how we see things differently? If we come at it strictly about one issue, it might be difficult for us to build larger groups of people to work and organize. But if we come at it from a broader point of view, for instance, there are lots of people who disagree with me about the right for women to have abortions. There are lots of people who would say that that very statement means that I should not be a pastor. But there are very few people, very few women who would disagree with me about the right for a woman to make decisions about their own lives. So I'm going to stop because it's just a tactic. But my desire is to not just talk to people who think like me, but to model what I believe we're all called to do. And that is to see the humanity in one another and to honor how that humanity shows up in the other, even if it's not the way that I do it, across faiths, across class, across race, across gender presentation, across all of the isms, all of the chasms. We have to find a way to focus on what we are for. And if we can get synergy on what we are for, I believe that we can begin to have deep conversations, transformational conversations about the places where we disagree. Now that's long work. We won't get it done by November. But the long game is important.
Thank you, Tracy. I think what you're talking about is also the essence of the democratic ideal, that many of the conversations I have had, because I have stepped into conversation with people with whom I know I have nothing in common, and we are not on the same page politically. But when I proposed to them that the whole point of democracy, right, was that we could work together to find a middle way.
Yeah.
If we respect each other's differences, we would look for the common ground, and that was part of the purpose of democracy, and that it was an essential gift that we've been given, is that capacity to sit with each other, know that we're not going to agree, and find a way to move. If we don't, even if you don't find common ground, to find the thing where we can compromise. Mm-hmm. And that in that compromise, we were strong. Mm-hmm. We were honoring our democracy. And they would nod. They'll nod. I mean, there are those now who are saying, no, I'm ready to have a dictator.
I was in a room last week, and I will be quiet after this. I was in a room last week to have conversation with 59 spiritual leaders who are trying to find a way to be different. I want you to hear that as hopeful. Mm-hmm. Who literally are trying to find a way to hold on to the core elements of their faith and be different in this democratic process right now. It's a secret, but it's happening, right? And I hope that a part of the work we will do as the parliament is to reach for a language that transcends religious division to have these conversations. Now I really will be quiet. Sorry.
I'll pick up on that theme, though, because I think we all need some signs of hope. I would guess. I know I do, at least. And even just sitting here and listening to all of us talk has deepened my analysis, because I think there's a lot of truth to this idea that, I grew up with an education that taught me that things would always progress, right? And now things are not progressing. And so it takes a lot, even as I study this you know, around the clock. It takes a lot for it to sink in. So just listening to us talk has helped me kind of stand in this reality and deepen the analysis. And I think that points to solidarity, one of the virtues of solidarity, what we get from solidarity. We get courage, support, analysis, the shoring up of our reality, even as the lies come at us. And no matter how strong we are, intellectually, spiritually, those lies still have an impact on us. And we still have to gather to shore ourselves up. To give some glimmers, some more images of hope. A few weeks ago, I was out in Arizona at a gathering of evangelical, 150 white evangelical, some Black evangelical, a few Latino, but largely white, who are gathering to talk about depolarization and peacemaking, and some of whom have taken stances and lost half their congregations, then rebuilt their congregations with other people who have left other congregations that they could no longer stomach. They're spiritual nomads. After I spoke at the Parliament of World Religions, a man came backstage and he was dressed in what I perceived to be Orthodox robes, possibly Russian Orthodox robes. And I had spoken to the role of Russia in some of this. And I steeled myself up. I was nervous, so I took a deep breath. And it turned out he is a courageous Baptist bishop from the country of Georgia, who is an advocate for LGBTQ and religious minorities, who has had bricks thrown through his car windshield and is organizing in the Republic of Georgia. And so we've struck up a friendship. And I love the fact that I live in the state of Georgia and he's in the Republic of Georgia. There's some symmetry there, and we are conspiring and talking together, and I'm learning a lot from him. But all that to say, as I travel around the country and I travel around the globe, there are amazing people doing really courageous things, and that is what it's going to take. And the more we can connect with each other and learn from each other and stay open to each other, the more we will continue to be able to build a democracy where everyone flourishes. Solidarity.
Wonderful. And I just want to say a few words. I know, Phyllis, we want to move into breakout rooms, I think, right? Shortly.
Yeah.
But let me just say that you guys, I think so beautifully said why I joined the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington, that the work of interfaith work is so vital to democracy. And I mean, if we think of it, interfaith by definition requires a measure of religious humility and the valuing of pluralism. Engaging in interfaith activities is part of cultivating a culture that can nourish a vibrant democracy. So being part of an interfaith movement means that at the most basic level, you recognize and value being part of a larger, diverse community that involves more than your particular tribal religious group, and that you value finding common ground with people who may appear different than you. That you don't see yourself as superior or inferior, more or less deserving of God's or anyone's love. So that every being is precious and everyone matters. So part of what I guess I want to suggest is that if your area has an interfaith group, join it. and our IFC MW, we're clearly available to anyone, but we're supposedly designed for the metropolitan regional area. But of course, given that we're Washington, which is the capital of the country, I imagine that we're available to everyone. But I just want to support. Part of the activism is to, as you said, solidarity, but part of that is going even beyond one's religious group and joining interfaith events and activities and joining. And I just want to say, one of the things that inspires me about my own Zoroastrian faith is that we believe in the concept of freshkat, which means to refresh, and adherents are given permission and encouraged to refresh and renew our values and traditions, and by doing so, our cultures and the world. In other words, we don't believe that traditions, religions, culture should remain static or fixed. That as we humans evolve in consciousness, awareness, and understanding, so should they. So we should be involved in reforming our religions in a way, and that it's a process of renewal. I mean, and the other piece that I love, there's so much about all our faiths that's so beautiful. And one of the other things I know in Zoroastrianism, we don't have a concept of being saved, but to the extent that we have that concept, no one can be saved unless everyone is saved. So there's no idea that we're going to be this little group that gets saved. We have to save we have to be there for one another. So I just want to end on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been rich, fruitful, and inspiring, I know. My hope and my prayer is that these conversations will be able to go forward, that we will not enter periods where to have these conversations are dangerous. But we are all, the four of us, and I think certainly many of those who are attending, we're aware that these conversations have the potential to put targets on each of us, and even those of you who have participated, that having the courage to act, even in the simplest way of expressing one's opposition and one's faith in autocratic societies, in dictatorships, is dangerous. And the death of Navalny is one of the most recent and heartbreaking examples. But our time here is limited. We have 1 billion heartbeats. And each of us has a faith that requires of us that we live in the way that we're meant to, in ways that make our own lives healthy and happy, but also make the world in which we live a better place. And our courage comes from our faith. In my faith, my courage comes from the world itself, which has at its heart, in all of nature, an organizing principle, an innate capacity that every living thing has to know instinctually how to interpret its DNA, its guidance system of how to live as a snail and a tree and a fox terrier who's sleeping in the corner, to live in the ways that make it healthy and happy. And then the extraordinary and very holy, sacred, sort of magical part of that is that when living things take care of themselves as they're meant to, it turns out that they make the world in which they live a better place for all living things. It's the natural order. And we're being called home. So for each of you, for being courageous in coming to have this conversation, in all the actions that you're taking every day, I'm deeply grateful. I know that everybody who's here and who will hear this conversation in the future will be inspired, and inspired to take the actions themselves, which require their courage, but which will reward them with courage. And nature teaches us nothing gets hoarded. These systems never work. They all create them thinking that they have before them somehow immortality, and that the authoritarian state, the kingship, will last for 1,000 years. And they don't. They always break because they're unnatural. So let us have confidence that in the end we'll win. And I thank you. And so let's take a quick look, see if there are any. We got a lot of thanks, voting days, many, many thanks here in the chats. I pray for all to have courage to embrace the chaos and disruption so change can happen, Mother Earth and Gaia. Yeah. Again, appreciation to all of you and to the Parliament. So many thank yous. Emma, you're back with us. Do you?
Yeah, Phyllis, we do have some wonderful questions in the chat. I'll just go with, I'll combine a couple of them. We've got a question that says, how can we get people to see how religion is functioning without seeming like we're against religions? And I'll combine that with this other question. How do we motivate, educate, inspire women and others who are somehow hooked by the promise, charm, deceptiveness of tyranny and autocracy?
Let's take the first one first. Would you repeat it?
Yes. back to it. How can we get people to see how religion is functioning without seeming like we're against religions?
I mean, I think it's so important to lead with where you agree in conversations. And then state clearly where you have a difference, and to if you are a religious spiritual person, to share from a place of faith. I know many of us, at least I was taught, not to go there, not to bring religion and politics into a conversation, right? Or not to share faith because I might seem like an evangelical Christian trying to Bible thump or something like that, But I think religion is a language, and whether you share the exact same faith or not, it's a way of, helping people understand that we have shared values, even if we have different ways of arriving at those values. And I just think it's really important in these times that we reclaim our faiths for justice and for democracy. With the other side, what the coalition and the transnational movement of autocrats wants is to pit religion against the rest of the world, which they say is secular and morally depraved. And we cannot let them have the language of faith. We can't let them have it because it gives us moral courage, and what they are doing is the opposite of faith. We cannot let them demoralize people in that way, and we can't let them weaponize faith in ways that harms other people. So lean into our faith and always model, in doing so, respect for all faiths and those who subscribe to something that's not faith but is moral values led. So model pluralism and respect for all, even as you do that.
Just piggybacking on what Jennifer was saying, in a book that I published a couple of years ago called Generative Cultural Renewal, second part of the book is about culture change and how we orchestrate culture change in a way. And there's a framework I developed anyway, but it's called IPA, identify, and but part of the P is preserve and the A is alter. So there are things we want to change, but there are things we want to preserve. So I think what Jennifer was saying is also there's things precious in our religions and things that are beautiful. So that needs to be highlighted. So we're not just trying to destroy or change everything. We want to preserve and hold what's precious. And so even though there are things that I've obviously described as being problematic in religions, that's the A part, the altering. But the P part, what do we want to preserve? And there's so much that's beautiful in our religion. So lead with that and then develop what needs to be changed. I would just add that piece.
I would add just a couple of practical tactics. Learn to lead by listening instead of assuming. No religion is monolithic. So even if you think you know something about someone else's faith, it might not necessarily mean that you know something about that particular person's faith. Learn to lead by listening. When speaking about faith in one-on-one dialogue, use the I voice. Don't presume to speak for everyone who associates with whatever. Use the I voice. Own what you're saying as your own. And make space for whomever you're engaging in conversation to be able to own what they believe as their own. It is not about a judgment. It is not about trying to convince someone that you are right and they are wrong. And for Christians, that's very hard for us. I'm just going to own that, right? It is not about that. It's about engaging someone in dialogue with a desire to understand, seeking knowledge and seeking wisdom. I'll give you a quick example. One of my closest friends is Rabbi Susan Talvi, and I say her name because many people know Rabbi Susan Talvi nationally. And we became friends because we spent quite a bit of time together in the aftermath of Michael Brown Jr.'s death. In the course of that, I would often talk about scripture because preachers do that a lot, and would get to the end of my story and she would say, "That's not how that story goes." I'd be using something, of course, that she was familiar with. There were also times when she would say, "You know, that reminds me of such and such." And she'd be telling the story and I'd be nodding. And then, she'd take some twist that I'd never heard of. And I'd say, "That's not how that story is in the Bible." And so from that, we decided we would study together, and it formed a friendship, a sisterhood that has endured. One day I met her at Starbucks for some coffee. And sipping her coffee, she asked me, "Why do you call my scripture the Old Testament?" I said, "Because in seminary, I learned that it was Testament. And because we have a New Testament, duh." And she looked at me and she nodded. And then she said to me, "When you call my text the Old Testament, it makes me feel as though you think my faith is dead." And then she simply sipped her coffee and changed the subject. That one encounter, without further conversation, made me start to think, that's not what I'm trying to do. And from thinking that's not what I'm trying to do, and this person is someone I care about, I began asking myself, what does it cost me not to say Old Testament? What do I lose as a leader to hear her? And I decided nothing. And so now I say First Testament or Hebrew scripture. But my point of sharing the story with you is sometimes we can instigate change more easily by listening and seeing the other, using our I voice. And she just shared with me how it made her feel. One-on-one, I care about how she feels. I'm just offering.
Thank you. I believe we have time for one more audience question. This question is, how do we counter all the disinformation? What tools of education and information are best to use? And what mediums, considering the changes in media that we've experienced over the past few years, with loss of newspapers, non-biased media, how to reach people who don't read books?
I think that Reverend T just answered that question most effectively. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Lincoln Project, but they amuse me. I don't know that they're actually affecting change in the community where the change needs to take place. But those difficult conversations that are coming from the heart and are not seeking to change, but to hear the other person is where you start. They're not going to change the channel, but they may sit down and have coffee with you, right? Or talk to you across the fence when you start the conversation about, your kids or whatever.
I just want to say, I think that's right. It's back to the basics, right? And I want to admit to the temptation that it'd be so much nicer just to put a message on Twitter or Facebook to think we could change the world, So that's a real temptation for all of us. And yet I think we know in our guts, and I know in my gut, that I need to put myself in places where I'll be able to have conversations in the way that Tracy outlined, which means a certain amount of spiritual preparedness, a great amount of courage. I think Sometimes people think of activists at the front lines doing civil disobedience as being courageous, but I think the real courageous thing is to have that conversation with someone with whom you disagree and to put yourself in these new circumstances. I think that's the only way that we overcome and that we do this.
And maybe that's why women are in such a position to make a difference, because we are the ones who focus on relationships and holding one another and friendships, and and I think exactly these everyday actions of knowing that our neighbors are struggling with something, listening to what's going on in their lives, and caring. I mean, people, there's so much that's frightening in the world, and how many of us know that someone has our back, and so just being there for one another, sharing whatever the struggles are, the pain. That's a doorway. It's not, we don't have to do it from a place of wanting an outcome, but just being there for each other in a caring way. I think that's that's important. And I think women are on the forefront of that.
All right, Emma, anything else? I mean, we could go on. I'd love to.
Yeah, we can go on to closing remarks, and then we'll have the breakout activity after that.
This is a strange and critical moment that we all find ourselves in. And each of us has a capacity, I think, from the faiths from which we come, to do the things that are necessary to sustain our own optimism, and to take the actions that nourish that optimism, and to offer that to one another. You put your flag where you are. You do what you can where you are. My mother always used to say, do the best you can with what you have. That's all you have to do. I think she was right. And I think as we do that, that we're going to be, people are always asking, what do I think is going to happen? We have a reputation for being able to see into the future. I was at Cassandra more than 20 years ago, talking about the floor plan that had been laid out, and here we are. I think the future will be determined by all of these flags of freedom and support and deep heart being planted by each of us as best we can with what we have where we are. And I'm looking forward to having another conversation with all of you, perhaps shortly before the election, and certainly after it. And I have great confidence that everybody who attended and joined us will come away from this deeply inspired by their own capacity to find hope through the actions that they take, and to know that they're making the world a better place because they're here, whatever faith inspires and nourishes and sustains them. You've all been a gift. I'm very grateful for each of you, for all of you, and Emma for the hard work you've done on this, and Miriam. And I am grateful for the work that you're going to do in making the world a better place. And it will be. It will be. So I think that's it. Emma, if you want to put folks into breakout groups, if they're interested in doing that, we have a list of resources that can nourish and sustain you. The books that have been written, the sermons that have been given, you'll find on YouTube, you'll find the books. You should read them. They will inspire you and draw forth your own courage and engagement. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon. Offer prayers for the safety and the well-being of our activists on the front lines, and for each of us across the back fence.
Thank you. And thank you for our speakers for being present. And for those who are left to join us for the end of the event, we're now going to go into some small breakout rooms for group discussions. So our discussion for today's event is, how can you or your community use your civic voice to support women on the front lines? And we're going to ask each group to come up with a list of actions that can be taken immediately. As you go into your small groups, we encourage each group to assign someone to each role of being a facilitator to make sure that everyone expresses their voice and has a turn to speak. Someone to keep time to make sure that each person has a fair amount of time. And then someone to take notes. When we come back, I'll ask every group to share their list in the chat or on a whiteboard. And yes, I'm sorry, Susan, did you have a question before? Okay. And so these lists, we have some examples just to inspire you. So some types of actions that you might come up with are petitions that could be signed. For example, some out there that we've seen right now are the Equal Rights Amendment, Equal Representation and Arbitration Pledge, Protect WIC, and Female Genital Mutilation. You come up with ideas for hosting a group in a home or community space to offer a safe space for women to discuss current issues, concerns, and hopes. For example, perhaps reading and discussion of the Declaration for the Dignity of Human Rights of Women. You could come up with ideas for volunteering, such as volunteering at the polls in the upcoming elections. Or you can make a list of causes that elected officials could be contacted for to advocate for, whether that's ceasefire, protection of women's bodily autonomy, or contacting the SEC to demand immediate action in the Congo. So those are some inspiration, but come up with your lists in your chat, in your discussions. We're going to go ahead and open the rooms, and you'll have 20 minutes for conversation. So you should see a button to go ahead and join your rooms. Welcome back. I think everyone is back in. And we'd like to take a moment to hear from everyone about what they came up with and discussed in their groups. So you'll see on this whiteboard, you can copy and paste what you came up with for your action lists into here. Or if you're not quite sure how to do so, you can also put them in the chat. If anyone from any groups would like to share out loud what they came up with, go ahead and raise your hand and I can allow to speak. All right, we've got you can go ahead and unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I don't know how to turn my video on. Is it on or off?
We don't have the ability in the webinar for
people can
attendees
hear
to.
me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, we had a nice surprise because my group was myself and Emily Echevarria, and we work together and know each other very well. So we had a deep conversation, but we're focused on climate action and the environment. And so we were pointing out to each other that around the world, but we were particularly thinking of Africa, it's women who are on the front lines of climate change because they're closer to the land. So if there's a drought, it's women who have to walk to pick up water, get water for their, and also women are very involved in food production, have deep knowledge of plants. So anything that affects agriculture and the water supply, and all of this is involved in care of their families. The women are on the front lines for climate action because of these circumstances. And not to take up too much time, there was one other thing that we strongly agreed on, which is, and this is in any locality, whatever issue you're most concerned about, you need to find out in your neighborhood, in your town, in your city, who's working on that, what groups already exist. Go, as Susan was saying, our first speaker, know if you have an interfaith group, near you, and go and get involved. An interfaith group is building understanding, tolerance, as we were talking about, but also there are groups for voting rights, groups on all kinds of different issues. So we should know our local groups and go get involved, learn from them, and support them. Thank you.
Thank you. Maruk has her hand up. You can go ahead and unmute and share.
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing this. I mean, this has been really very enlightening. We had a lovely group. We had Miriam, of course, and thank you, Miriam, for all your efforts here. We had Dolly, and then we had Barry, and interesting conversation regarding how to mobilize like-minded people, and how to get information from everywhere, digest all that information, and discern for yourself what's the right path for you. And I think that was one of the conversations that was happening too, about the information versus disinformation that is there. But you have to believe, you have to start with what's out there and start to build in that regard, and join local communities that have options or give you platform to speak. There are a lot of women in the society who, and I may be one of them, because being so polarized right now, the community, it's almost like you shrink in your little space and say, I'm not going to make a difference, even if I said something. But that's not the right approach, as I'm understanding. No matter how small, no matter how limited information you have, but if you get out there and start speaking, I think you will gain confidence. And the other thing too, you will also start speaking for all the other rest of the women who are unable to find their voices for many reasons. They may be busy with their lives, they may have challenges. You speak for them. You stand up for them. And so the local communities are an opportunity to get involved. Barry gave a very good example about the women in South Africa, how they started doing something so small with a little grant that they got. But with that grant, they were able to achieve so much. They were providing education for their children. Nothing is small or nothing is short. Nothing is less. We just have to do it. And I think the collective effort eventually, I think, will reap benefits for just not the women, but for the entire world. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, looks like we've got Anne's hand up. Anne, you can go ahead and unmute.
Several things. We talked about the power of love, and we talked about how those who are in the spiritual realm of that message and living out love also need to be spiritual activists, so that you do the contemplation, the meditation, and action. And then we also talked about changing the narrative of hate and all the hate crimes and how that has been so harmful and destructive, and changing that narrative to a narrative in which there is love, mutual respect for all. And when we do all, going beyond us as human beings, but as we talked about earlier by Kasumata, of creation, of all creation, we can learn from nature. We can learn from nature of how each one of us needs to be valued and value the other, not one over the other or more important than the other. And then I just wanted to do a plug for our March 22nd event, which will be at the United Nations, and will be in the Church Center building on the 10th floor at 2:30, which is Women and Girls on the Front Lines of Climate Actions. The women who know and live what it is to be in these areas that need change, and know what that kind of change is and are the change. So that's my spiel. And we had Molly in there, and we had Pamela and Molly.
Thank you. And is there anyone else that would like to share before we close? All right, well, thank you to everyone for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just for our closing remarks. So we've got some homework for everyone. Our homework over the next couple of weeks is to take a photo of an action that you take over the next couple of weeks. Something that we discussed today, something that was that we came up with a lot of great ideas, or something else. So take a photo of yourself taking an action and post that to social media and or our FOCUS24 Zoom chat. If you post to social media, remember to tag the Parliament. On Instagram, that is at Interfaith World. And on Facebook, that is at Parliament of the World's Religions. And use hashtags Faith in Democracy and FOCUS24. Another action that you can take is to sign the Parliament's Global Ethic document. You can do that at the Parliament's website /Global Ethic. So that's parliamentofreligions.org/global ethic. Mark your calendars for our next upcoming FOCUS24 events. You can visit the FOCUS24 section of the Parliament's website for information about all FOCUS24 events. The next two events are March 12th, Religion and Civic Spaces, Navigating Challenges and Fostering Unity. And on April 18th, Strategies for Community Organizing and Civic Mobilization. We'd also like to encourage all FOCUS24 participants to engage in the FOCUS24 community space in Zoom throughout the year in between events. After this meeting ends, you can find this community space in your Zoom by going to Team Chat along the top of the Zoom app window and then channels along the side menu. And every participant should have received an invitation to this space. This is a space for open forum, responding to conversation prompts, sharing resources, and networking. You can head there right after this event to introduce yourself and find resources that were shared during this event. All FOCUS24 events are recorded and will be accessible to all FOCUS24 registrants throughout the year. You can find recordings of past events in the FOCUS24 section of the Parliament's website and then clicking on All Access. After the end of the year, these recordings will be archived into the Parliament's digital archives, which Parliament members will continue to have access to. If you are not already a Parliament member, you can become a member today to support the Parliament's work and enjoy access to digital archives, a global network, exclusive events, and Parliament event discounts. Visit parliamentofreligions.org/membership